It is May 1873, and deep in the heart of Africa, by the light of a dying fire, a small group of men gather in silence around the body of their leader. Carefully and with great reverence, they cut him open and remove his heart, and bury it beneath a nearby tree. And then, over the days that follow, they set about the long, painstaking work of preserving what remains, drying the body in the fierce equatorial sun, preparing it for an extraordinary journey of nearly 1,000 miles to the coast, and the ship that will carry him home to England. That man was David Livingstone, Britain's most celebrated explorer. And his story does not end here in the African bush. It ends in Westminster Abbey, among kings and statesmen and generals and poets. But why was David Livingstone buried there without his heart? To answer that, we have to go back nearly 50 years to a single room in a Scottish mill town, and a boy who never meant to go to Africa at all. David Livingstone was born in a one-room tenement in the town of Blantyre, Scotland, on the 19th of March 1813. By the age of 10, he was working in the local cotton mill. But young David dreamed of becoming a doctor and a missionary. After his 14-hour shift each day, he would attend night school, and eventually in 1836 enrolled at Anderson's College in Glasgow, a forerunner of Strathclyde University, to read medicine, Greek and theology. Funding his studies by returning each summer to work in the mill, he eventually graduated in 1840 and was accepted by the London Missionary Society. And this is where our story takes a surprising turn. The man who would become known as one of the greatest British explorers in Africa actually ended up on the continent by accident. His original plan was to be a missionary in China, but when the First Opium War closed that door, he was persuaded by the veteran missionary Robert Moffat to join him on the northern frontier of the Cape Colony in South Africa. Arriving at Cape Town in March 1841, he took the 4-month-long ox wagon journey 600 miles north to Moffat's mission station. Keen to take the word of God to people who had not yet met a Christian missionary, within 2 years David Livingstone had set up his own station about 300 miles further inland in what would within a decade become the Boer Republic of Transvaal. It was there that he was attacked by a lion. Livingstone later wrote that the lion grabbed his left arm and shook him like a terrier does with a rat. His left arm was shattered, and with no hospital facilities for hundreds of miles, Livingstone was forced to let the arm heal itself, and the humerus knitted into a false joint. That injury meant that he would never be able to use his left arm effectively again. It also will become a crucial part of our story later on. A year later, in 1845, Livingstone married Moffat's daughter, Mary. They would have 6 children together, the oldest of whom, Robert, would go on to fight in the American Civil War and died in a Confederate POW camp. Whilst David Livingstone is often referred to as a missionary and explorer in that order, his conversion record was poor, and it's as an explorer that he is better remembered. That fame started in 1849, when, in the company of 2 hunters, he crossed the Kalahari Desert, becoming the first Europeans to ever reach Lake Ngami, in the very north of what is now Botswana. He then ventured even further north into the upper reaches of the Zambezi River, continuing across modern-day Angola and arriving at Luanda on the west coast of Africa in 1854. Despite being desperately ill, Livingstone refused the offer of a ship back to Britain. Instead, he turned around and set out for the other side of the continent. 2 years later, he reached Mozambique on the east coast, a journey of 4,000 miles, the first European to ever cross southern or central Africa from one coast to the other. En route, he had also become the first European to witness what locals called the smoke that thunders. Livingstone named the huge waterfall on the Zambezi River in honour of his queen back in Britain, the Victoria Falls. He arrived back in England in 1856 a national hero. The Royal Geographical Society presented him with their gold medal, and his book, Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, published the following year, sold 70,000 copies. Whilst in Britain, he had addressed a packed meeting at the Senate House in Cambridge. As the eager audience listened to their new hero, he issued a rallying cry. "I go back to Africa to make an open path for commerce and Christianity. Do you carry out the work that I have begun?" Many were willing for that challenge. Explorers would follow in his wake. New missionaries would venture forth, and eventually, so too, would commercial and imperial adventurers. His path to the interior was the Zambezi River, a water superhighway to open Africa to European commerce and vice versa, and to build locals' economies which would counter the destructive East African Arab slave trade. The following year, Livingstone, now appointed British consul, resigned from the London Missionary Society and set off, at the head of an ambitious British government-led expedition. Unlike his Trans-Africa expedition, where Livingstone's only companions had been local Africans, he was accompanied by government-appointed experts, including a Royal Navy captain called Norman Bedingfield, the artist Thomas Baines, John Kirk acting as physician and naturalist, and his younger brother. He was also joined once more by his wife Mary. A steamboat that had been transported in sections was assembled at the mouth of the Zambezi River, and the expedition finally set off. 2 more steamers would join them during the 6-year project. The Zambezi Highway into the African interior turned out to be a misconceived idea by the Scottish missionary come explorer. During his previous journey from coast to coast, he had followed the path of the Zambezi, but at a few junctures had journeyed away from the riverbank. And now that was to come back and bite him. At one of the places where he had veered away, Livingstone now found to his horror a series of formidable rapids. The route to the interior was blocked. Disappointed, and with Captain Bedingfield increasingly critical of the mission, Livingstone turned up another river, the Shire, and eventually reached the highland area of modern-day Malawi. There he and his companions became the first Europeans to see Lake Nyasa, although of course locals had seen it many times before over the years. It was here as well that Livingstone witnessed something else: the results of Arab slave traders operating out of Zanzibar. Fired up by his Christian conscience, he vowed to destroy the East African slave trade. By now, however, with the Royal Navy officer having resigned and the Zambezi closed to the steamboats, the British government had had enough. They pulled the funding and ordered Livingstone home. His homecoming was in marked contrast to his triumphant arrival just 8 years beforehand. His fame as an explorer was tarnished. His dreams of the river highway into Africa were dead. And he was a widower. Mary had died whilst on his expedition in 1862. And yet, despite these bitter pills, he would return to Africa one more time. This time in search of the source of the River Nile. Contrary to pop culture, David Livingstone was not the only British explorer in Africa, nor was he the first. Others, such as Mungo Park, had been there long before him, and during his own lifetime, Richard Burton, John Hanning Speke, and Samuel Baker were making their own marks on the continent. The prize that motivated them was to find the source of the River Nile. The problem was that no one could agree exactly where that source was. It led to a bitter feud between Burton and Speke, which only ended with Speke's death in 1864. With no resolution, in 1866, the Royal Geographical Society decided to send Livingstone to discover the definitive answer. Arriving on the coast of modern-day Tanzania, David Livingstone set off inland. Almost immediately, his expedition was in peril. A large group of his porters deserted. Arriving back at the coast, They covered up their actions by claiming that the Scotsman was dead. A claim that was reported in the British press and inspired an expedition to find his body. More of that in a moment. Meanwhile, very much alive, Livingstone continued his journey across modern-day Tanzania towards Lake Tanganyika, which incidentally Burton and Speke had been the first Europeans to alight upon in 1858. Whilst en route, he suffered yet another desertion of porters, and this one would have ultimately dire results. The deserters took Livingstone's medical chest, in which was his supply of quinine, without which, inside deep malaria country, it was a death sentence for many Europeans. In March 1869, he finally arrived at the Arab-Swahili trading town of Ujiji on the eastern shore of Lake Tanganyika, only to find that the supplies he'd sent forward in advance had been plundered. Emaciated and suffering from malaria, Livingstone was kept alive by the kindness of the Arab slave traders, the very men whom he'd vowed to destroy. Livingstone now heard from locals that beyond the lake to the west was a mighty river, the Lualaba. He became convinced that such a huge waterway was surely the Nile in its early form, and set out to find it and its source. It was whilst doing that he arrived at the town of Nyange in modern-day Burundi. It was here, on the 15th of July 1871, that he witnessed an event that left him horrified, angry and impotent. As he looked on, Arab slave traders launched an attack on the town, where the market was occupied principally by local women. Hundreds, Livingstone claimed 400, were gunned down, and many more were captured. There was absolutely nothing he could do about it, except watch on. Well, that's not quite true. There was something he could do. He could write. The dispatch that he penned describing the attack was carried by runners to the coast and thence by ship to Britain, and when published it caused an outpouring of anti-slavery anger that would ultimately prove to be the Zanzibar Arabs' downfall. However, in the meantime, broken in body and now spirit, Livingstone made his way back down the eastern shoreline of Lake Tanganyika to Ujiji. And it was there, on the 10th of November 1871, that a young reporter from the New York Herald appeared. The previous reports of Livingstone's death had prompted the owner of the newspaper to fund an expedition to find Livingstone, dead or alive. The reporter come adventurer that they employed was Welsh-born US citizen Henry Morton Stanley. And it was here, on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, that Stanley uttered the immortal line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Or at least, we presume he did, as the only person to record that meeting was the publicity-hungry reporter Stanley. But it's a great line, and we all know it, so let's just let it lie. The two men now explored the northern end of Lake Tanganyika together and agreed that it didn't feed the Nile. But despite his pleas, Livingstone refused to return to Britain with Stanley. Instead, he now turned south by himself, still chasing the Lualaba River and the source of the Nile. He never did find that source, and indeed the Lualaba doesn't feed the Nile at all, but another mighty river in Africa, the Congo. Moving through vast swamplands in modern-day Zambia, suffering from malaria, dysentery and internal bleeding, the broken Livingstone had to be carried by his loyal African porters. Finally, on the 1st of May 1873, just weeks after his 60th birthday, David Livingstone was found kneeling as if in prayer, dead. In his 30-year career on the continent, he had travelled 29,000 miles across Africa, more than any other European explorer. Which brings us to the event at the very start of our story. His loyal African companions were in a dilemma. Should they bury him on the continent that he had loved, amongst the people whom he cared for and who cared for him? Or should his body return to his homeland? They decided to compromise. His body would return to Britain, but his heart would remain in Africa. It was carefully cut out and buried under a tree. On the tree, former slave Jacob Wainwright carved a short inscription to honour their friend. Livingstone's body was then preserved as best they could, and then carried 1,000 miles to the coast by a party of up to 70 Africans, including Wainwright and two of the explorer's closest companions, James Chuma and David Susi. After 9 long months, they finally reached Zanzibar, where the body was placed in a coffin and shipped to England, accompanied by Jacob Wainwright. He was one of the 8 pallbearers, and the only African one, when David Livingstone was buried at Westminster Abbey on the 18th of April, 1874. Upon arrival in Britain, there was some uncertainty as to whether the body was actually Livingstone's, until a medical examination identified the false joint in his left arm, left by that lion attack 30 years beforehand. Despite all the other incredible 19th century explorers, David Livingstone remains Britain's most famous explorer of the African continent, although that fame seems to centre around the Victoria Falls and the phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." And yet, his legacy is far more than either of those. For instance, did you know that the Royal Scottish Geographical Society's most prestigious award is the David Livingstone Medal? Instituted by his daughter, recipients have included Neil Armstrong, Sir Ranulph Fiennes, and Sir David Attenborough. His dispatches, vividly recording the massacre of Africans by Arab slave traders, shone a light on the East African slave trade. The Royal Navy had been fighting a low-key war against the Arab slavers for nearly 50 years. Indeed, Jacob Wainwright had been rescued from an Arab slave dhow. But Livingstone's writings finally galvanised British public and political opinion. In June 1873, just a month after Livingstone's death, not that people back in Britain were aware of it yet, John Kirk, who had accompanied the Zambezi Expedition, negotiated a treaty with the Sultan of Zanzibar to curtail the trade, although it would take several more decades for it to completely stop. Livingstone's explorations and publicity around them helped awaken European powers to the opportunities in Central Africa, feeding the scramble for Africa, although it's unlikely he would have approved of the form it took. The mission stations that he inspired in the Shire Highlands during his failed Zambezi expedition formed the nucleus of the country of Malawi, where his name is still revered to this day. Indeed, the commercial capital, Blantyre, is named after the town of his birth, and scholarships still carry young Malawians to his old university in Scotland. Livingstone's death in 1873 did not draw down the curtain on epic journeys of exploration in Africa, nor did it end the slave trade. Arab slave traders were still active in the north, not least in Sudan, and it was to this part of Africa that an Englishman was sent to wipe it out, another explorer by the name of Samuel Baker. And his story, less well known, is equally as fascinating and impactful as David Livingstone's. So watch this space. If you love British history, not just the battles, but the wider characters and events through the centuries, then you might enjoy my free weekly newsletter, where I go into more detail about some of the stories I don't cover here on YouTube. Start getting your copy by clicking on the link in the description. And let's keep sharing fantastic forgotten stories from British history.